Plantagenet monarch, was long vilified as a hunchbacked villain by Shakespeare and Tudor chroniclers. Yet was he truly the monster of legend or a victim of ruthless propaganda? In this deep dive, we'll explore Richard's life from birth to battle and the modern research that has rewritten his story. If you're passionate about history, smash that like button and subscribe for more historical investigations. Richard III, born October 2, 1452 at Fotheringhay Castle, England, was the youngest surviving son of Richard, 3rd Duke of York and Cecily Neville. He became the last Yorkist King of England when he seized the throne from his nephew in 1483. His reign ended just 2 years later at the Battle of Bosworth field, August 22, 1485, where he was killed by forces led by Henry Tudor. For nearly 500 years after his death, Richard's name was synonymous with tyranny and evil, a reputation largely crafted by the Tudors and immortalized by William. In recent years, however, historians and archaeologists have re-evaluated that dark legend. We'll tell the story of Richard's rise and fall through engaging narration and rich historical detail, and uncover how new evidence is challenging the myths. The Wars of the Roses ignite. Our story unfolds in a turbulent era known as the Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, a series of dynastic civil wars for the English crown between the rival houses of Lancaster and York. This brutal conflict followed decades of weak rule under the Lancastrian King Henry VI and power struggles among powerful nobles. The Yorkist who claimed the throne, backed by the white rose emblem, eventually clashed with the Lancastrian red rose line. In the mid-1450s, Richard's father, Richard of York, emerged as a leading claimant, effectively challenging Henry VI's rule. Civil war erupted in 1455 when York asserted his claim. After York's death in battle 1460, his eldest son, Edward, defeated the Lancastrians and became King Edward IV in 1461. This marked the rise of Yorkist power and the beginning of Edward IV's reign. Though Richard was just a child when the conflict began, he was born into a family at the heart of the Yorkist claim. These wars of kinship would shape Richard's destiny and provide the canvas for the treacherous intrigue that defined his path to power. A duke is born. Richard of York entered the world at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire on October 2, 1452. He was the 7th surviving child of York and Neville, but the youngest of his brothers who would live to adulthood. His elder brothers were Edmund, George, and the future Edward IV. As the youngest son in a large aristocratic family, the young Richard was supremely well-born and well-connected, yet as a minor prince his prospects seemed limited. In fact, one early family chronicle tersely notes only that he liveth yet. Despite his lowly start, Richard grew up in the turmoil of civil war. During his childhood, his father twice served as Lord Protector for the mentally fragile King Henry V. In 1460, Richard's father was killed at Wakefield trying to claim the throne. The young Richard, only 8 years old, briefly went into exile on the continent but returned triumphantly when his brother Edward secured victory and was crowned King Edward IV in 1461. The dramatic reversal of fortune from exile to the Yorkist crown set the stage for Richard's future role. By Edward IV's ascension, Richard was a royal prince, and his older brothers continued to die off, leaving Richard further up in line than originally expected. Still a teenager in the 1460s, he was made Duke of Gloucester and inducted into the Order of the Garter. In this era of dynastic conflict, the Yorks had risen from captive courtiers to kings, and Richard's own fortunes were on the rise. In the service of King Edward IV, as Duke of Gloucester, Richard proved himself a fierce and loyal military leader for his brother, King Edward IV. In 1471, when the Wars of the Roses flared again, Richard was at the forefront. He fought at the Battle of Barnet, 1471, and at Tewkesbury, 1471, against Lancastrian forces, helping Edward IV secure the throne once more. At Tewkesbury, Richard even sat as a judge to condemn captured Lancastrian leaders, a grim task he performed with royal approval, ensuring the Yorkist victory was decisive. For his part in restoring Edward's power, Richard was richly rewarded. He married Anne Neville, the younger daughter of the legendary Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, who was also the widow of the Lancastrian Prince Edward. This marriage granted Richard vast estates and influence, especially in the north of England. Over the 1470s, he built a strong power base. He held key castles at Middleham, Scarborough, and Richmond, and even helped carry out an act of ruthless political expediency when his brother George, Duke of Clarence, was accused of treason in 1478 and executed. Richard remained Edward's favorite, cultivating royal favor and consolidating authority over the northern barons. By the early 1480s, Richard III had become one of the most powerful men in England, a loyal king's brother with large armies and lands. Yet he still did not expect to rule. Edward IV had two sons, the young Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, and it seemed the Yorkist line was secure. But fate had other plans. The crisis of 1483, death in April. On April 1483, tragedy struck the Yorkist dynasty. King Edward IV died unexpectedly after a brief illness. His eldest son, 12-year-old Edward V, was proclaimed king, but the boy was in Ludlow Castle in Shropshire, under the care of his uncle Richard of Gloucester, who was at Middleham in Yorkshire. Richard had been named Lord Protector by Edward IV's council, reportedly even at Edward's own request. News of Edward's death reached Richard around April 15th. He journeyed south to York Minster, solemnly swearing loyalty to his nephew as the new king. Then both Edward V and Richard, now 32, set out for London to meet and solidify the boy king's rule. As they traveled, however, Richard began to seize the reins of power. At Stony Stratford on April 29th, Richard's troops arrested Edward V's household members, including his maternal uncle Earl Rivers and brother Richard Grey, and had them sent to Yorkshire. They were executed on charges of treason on June 25th. Richard himself took charge of the princes, bringing the 12-year-old king and his 9-year-old brother to London under his protection. What followed was a shocking turn of events. The younger Richard of York was placed with the king's household, but a mysterious sermon in June 1483 began to change public opinion. In a fiery sermon at St. Paul's Cross on June 22nd, a doctor of divinity named Ralph Shaw proclaimed that Richard was the only legitimate heir of the House of York. Within days, Parliament declared the two boys illegitimate by invoking an old technicality about a pre-contract of Edward IV's marriage. In effect, it was said Edward IV's marriage was invalid, making his children bastards. Thus Richard's own claim became lawful. On July 6, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England. The events of that summer, 1483, remain one of English history's great controversies. By the time Richard took the throne, Edward V and his brother had vanished from public view. The only thing certain was that both princes were placed in the Tower of London before Richard's coronation. What happened to the young King Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, the princes in the Tower, has been a subject of enduring mystery and debate. The princes in the Tower. The cruel fate of the princes has become the most infamous stain on Richard III's reputation. According to contemporary chronicles, the two boys were lodged in the Tower by their uncle Richard, ostensibly awaiting Edward V's delayed coronation. But in the late summer of 1483, they disappeared from sight. No unbiased record exists of their deaths, only rumors and claims. Traditional accounts and Shakespeare's play allege that Richard had them murdered to remove any rival claim to the throne. For centuries, it has generally been assumed that they were murdered. A common hypothesis is that the murder was commissioned by Richard III. However, historians stress the evidence is circumstantial at best. When bones thought to be the princes were later found and interred, questions remained. No definitive proof connects Richard III himself to any crime. Indeed, some legends and theories suggest others, the Duke of Buckingham or even later Henry Tudor, could have been involved. Modern scholarship often notes that the charges against Richard regarding the princes are now considered likely Tudor propaganda, designed to vilify the Yorkist king. In truth, after 1483 the princes were never seen alive, and the mystery of their fate became a spectre haunting Richard's reign and reforms, 1483–85. Richard III's reign, though brief, 1483–1485, was not without accomplishment. Contemporary accounts, even from some critics, note that he was a relatively effective administrator. He introduced laws to reform local governance and to improve the legal system for ordinary subjects. For example, Richard passed an act that protected the property rights of widows and orphans, and he introduced penalties against illegal maintenance, nobles' abuse of power. In many ways he sought to appear as a good king of the law, ironic given his infamous posthumous image. Nevertheless, his reign was plagued by revolts and the legacy of mistrust. On October 14, 1483, the Duke of Buckingham led a rebellion against Richard. Buckingham had been a key supporter in Richard's rise, but when it turned out the princes were gone, he apparently felt betrayed. His revolt ultimately failed and he was executed. Richard was spared further large-scale challenge until 1485, but a quiet discontent simmered. Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant exiled in Brittany, began to move as a figurehead for Yorkist enemies. Richard also faced challenges on the continent. He had promised support to Brittany against French encroachment, but England's treasury was low and civil war was more pressing. By 1485, Richard was left with only one loyal ally of significance, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, in the north. Seeing that Henry Tudor was preparing an invasion from France, Richard began mustering an army. The Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485. The climax of Richard III's story came on August 22, 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field in Leicestershire. This was the final major clash of the Wars of the Roses. Leading a small force, Richard faced the army of Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who had landed in Wales and marched east under the banner of Lancaster. Historical accounts tell us Richard's army was larger, but his opponents, including defectors from Richard's own ranks, were increasingly numerous. The precise course of battle is debated, but it is clear Richard made a bold gamble. At a critical moment he led a cavalry charge aimed directly at Henry's standard. Things went disastrously wrong for Richard. Key nobles who had been guaranteed pardons by Henry, the Stanley family, withheld their forces. Richard's charge broke through to Henry himself, but in that moment King Richard found himself isolated. According to tradition, as Richard fought in the thick of combat, Sir William Stanley intervened on Henry's side and fell upon the Yorkist king's retreating men. Richard III was killed on the field, the last English monarch to die in combat. His crown was picked up from under a bush, and the battle was won by Henry Tudor's men. Henry Tudor was then proclaimed King Henry VII, bringing the Plantagenet dynasty to an end and founding the Tudor era. According to the chronicle of the time, Richard's death was portrayed immediately as a righteous triumph. Henry's supporters hired chroniclers to cast Bosworth as the dawning of a new era, the victory of good over evil. Shakespeare later cemented this narrative, making Richard's downfall the centerpiece of his play Richard III. But from the Yorkist perspective, Bosworth was the end of their medieval world. Henry Tudor would soon marry Edward IV's daughter Elizabeth, uniting the warring houses and truly ending decades of civil war. With Bosworth's outcome assured, Henry VII set out to strengthen his legitimacy. He married Elizabeth of York in 1486, famously knitting together the white and red roses and symbolically ending the conflict. His regime also went to great lengths to justify the new order. The Tudor myth was actively cultivated. Henry portrayed the previous era as a dark age of chaos requiring a strong, divinely sanctioned Tudor line to bring peace. In this propaganda campaign, Richard III became the poster child of all Yorkist sins, a deformed tyrant who murdered his nephews and seized the throne. Part of this campaign involved historians like Sir Thomas More and Polydore Virgil, who wrote scathingly of Richard, and official accounts that rewrote events. When Shakespeare wrote Richard III, around 1592 under Elizabeth I, he took these tales of Richard's villainy and dramatized them in unforgettable form. Shakespeare's Richard is a Machiavellian hunchback, gleefully cynical and bent on mayhem. But it's crucial to remember, Shakespeare was writing under Tudor rule, using Tudor source material as entertainment as much as history. Centuries of scholarship were influenced by this depiction. Even after Shakespeare, many historians painted Richard as the worst and most wicked of kings. For example, 18th-century writers like Horace Walpole accepted the Tudor portrayal uncritically. It wasn't until the 20th century that serious revisionist historians began to question the validity of those sources. Shakespeare's Richard, the myth of the hunchback king. Shakespeare's influence on Richard III's legend cannot be overstated. The king opens as a charismatic villain proclaiming, "Now is the winter of our discontent, made glorious summer by the son of York," and goes on to describe himself as deformed, unfinished. Audiences for centuries have seen Richard as the very embodiment of evil ambition. The famous "My kingdom for a horse" moment at Bosworth from Shakespeare's play solidified a romantic image of Richard dying bravely on the field of battle. However, modern scholarship urges caution. Shakespeare drew on Thomas More's History of King Richard III, written during Henry VIII's reign, and other Tudor sources. These were hardly unbiased documents. The tall tales, Richard's hunchback, a withered arm even having 6 fingers, originated in Tudor-era accounts and were likely exaggerations. Indeed, when Richard's actual skeleton was found, it showed severe scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but no evidence of the famously withered arm or monstrous appearance Shakespeare described. The later figure of Richard was more complex than the stage villain. In recent decades, the Shakespearean Richard has become a subject of critical historical analysis. Some historians accept that he was a ruthless politician by necessity but doubt he murdered his nephews. Others argue that even if Richard did order their deaths, it was a savage act in a brutal era, not a personal eccentricity. This scholarly debate, partly stirred by the Richard III Society and other Ricardian groups, has sought to peel back Tudor lies to find the real Richard. Rediscovering Richard Bones in Leicester. The greatest twist in Richard's story came in 2012, when a team led by the University of Leicester began excavating a social services car park in Leicester, guided by a local legend. Within hours they hit something extraordinary, a tomb with a skeleton that would capture the world's attention. The bones belonged to a man in his 30s who had battle injuries and a severe spinal curvature, scoliosis, exactly fitting Richard III's known age at death and description. Geneticists took DNA from the bones and compared it to known living descendants of Richard's sister Anne of York. The match was conclusive. On February 4, 2013, the University of Leicester announced with beyond a reasonable doubt that these were the remains of King Richard III. Newspapers splashed the story. The long-lost king had been found under a parking lot. The skeleton even provided vivid details: a violent death from a halberd blow to the skull, possible humiliation injuries after death, and yes, a crooked spine but no evidence of Shakespeare's fabled withered arm. This discovery turned public opinion again. In a way, the Real Richard was rewriting his own narrative centuries on. Museums and historians used the find to question Tudor-era descriptions. The King Richard III Visitor Centre in Leicester sprang up to showcase the evidence. Finally, in 2015, Richard III was given a formal reburial. On March 26, 2015, after a televised service attended by kings and queens, Richard was laid to rest in Leicester Cathedral. Though some argued he should lie in York or Westminster, the court ruled Leicester was fitting since that's where he was found. Re-evaluating Richard. Today, Richard III's legacy is far more nuanced than the caricature of the crooked king. Serious historians now say he was neither saint nor tyrant, but a man of his times, making hard choices in a bloody era. The surviving records from his own reign, administrative ordinances, council minutes and eyewitness chronicles, show a king concerned with justice and good governance, even as he fought ruthlessly to hold on to power. Enthusiasts from the Richard III Society point out that he had some loyal supporters and accomplished policies that benefited ordinary people. All this has fueled what could be called a historical revisionism about Richard's character. Nonetheless, many questions remain unanswered. We may never know the full truth about the princes in the tower or every motive behind Richard's actions. What we do know is that history is never fixed. New evidence, like the Leicester skeleton, can reshape our views. Richard III's life story is a powerful reminder that history is written by both victors and victims, and that evidence can overturn even the most famous myths. If you've enjoyed this hour-long journey through the Famographic show, be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts. Was Richard a monster or a martyr? And subscribe for more family content like this. Thanks for watching and keep questioning history.